Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff again. So we're talking more about revolutions and things that happen in world history, how governments are completely changing. Today we're going to talk about the American Revolution. Now, I know this might be a little shocking. I'm a little bit of an expert on American history. It's kind of my strength. As you guys know, that's what I teach the rest of the day, and I enjoy stretching my boundaries of world history. So what I'm going to do my hardest on, all right, is not going into crazy detail on this. So this is big picture stuff of what happens with the American Revolution. So it's really cool. All right, so I'm going to try to hit the high points of this stuff without getting down into the nitty gritty with Nathaniel Greene and things like that. Anywho, all right. So, America. Here's what happens. So, as we talked about yesterday, they had the English Civil War. England still has a king, right? So, there's a parliament they have to work with, but England does still have a king. We are now 100 years after the English Civil War. We're in the mid-1700s, all right? The King of England is King George. Now, what we know as of America today, at the time, was only 13 colonies. North Carolina was one of those colonies. We are not our own country. We are just colonies owned by England. So England owns us. England makes a lot of money off of America. All right? We grow a lot of tobacco and, as we mentioned earlier, cotton as well. But we're really focusing at this point on tobacco. It doesn't matter. Tobacco, cotton, both of those are cash crops. We grow them, we sell them. So a lot of the people that had moved over to America basically just wanted to be left alone, whether it's for religious reasons or whatever. A lot of people had moved over to America. So the rule was you could come over to America and basically do whatever you wanted. You are a British citizen because England, which is Britain, owns the colony. So you're a British citizen over here, but Britain just kind of leaves us alone and doesn't mess with us at all and lets us do whatever we want. In return, we just have to give them all our cotton and tobacco, right? And they rip us off. We're cool with that. Like, we know they're ripping us off and we're fine with that because what we want is just to be left alone, all right? So they have rules that we're supposed to follow and stuff, but we really don't follow them that much, mainly because we don't care. And England, as long as they're making bank off of us, they don't really care if we break these silly little rules. This has been happening for like hundreds of years up until about 1761. Then what happens is England and France, surprisingly, that's sarcasm, go to war. They go to war all the time. So France sees how much money England is making off the colonies. So France comes over to America to try to steal the colonies from England, all right? Obviously, England doesn't like this. So England sends troops over here to fight the French, to keep the French from stealing the colonies from the British. So if you lived in America at the time, you're in your backyard, your crop, and you're just working. The French, while they want to come over and steal the colonies, they don't want to kill any colonists because the colonists are the ones that like do all the work. And so while we know we're owned by England, we don't feel like we're English citizens. We're just like random people doing our own thing. So when they come over here, you're like working in your backyard as a colonist, and you look up and there's like an English dude and a French dude like just fighting it out over in another field, like just shooting at each other. Has nothing to do with us because England wants us to keep working. France doesn't want to kill us because they want us to keep working. So hopefully if they take us over, they can get all the money from us. So France doesn't have the same size army as England does. So France teams up with the Indians over here in America. So the French promise the Indians, because they're lying to them, if the Indians help the French take the colonies from England, the Indians get all their land back. Like, that's clearly not going to happen, but the Indians believe them, and the Indians side with the French. So England has to fight the French and the Indians over here to protect the colonists. All right, this is a pretty big war, and it lasts quite a while, last years, and eventually England wins because France has lost like every war they've ever fought. So France loses, and they have to leave and go home. All right, England wins, Yay. It's called the French and Indian War because you usually name the wars after whoever lost. So the French and the Indians lost. So the French and the Indians weren't fighting each other in the French and Indian War. It's England was fighting the French and Indians. They lost. The Indians scampered off into the mountains, and the French went home. Hooray. Didn't affect the colonists at all. We're like, whatever. Didn't care one way or other. Well, it cost a ton of money to fight that war. England needs to get that money, needs to get more money to pay back all their debts that they acquired during the French and Indian War. They think that since they were protecting the colonist, it should be the colonist responsibility to pay back all that debt. All right. So keep in mind, the colonists, us, we didn't care one way or other. Who cares which way do we ship our tobacco and cotton to? To France? Fine, as long as they leave us alone. Now England's like, hey, we did y'all a solid, not letting y'all get taken over by those evil French. So you're going to have to pay us a whole bunch of extra money now. Now, we're going to get really angry over this. Really, really, really angry over having to pay extra money. I think the big thing that gets lost in history is you think that America is mad about the money. We're not mad about the money. We don't care. We've been getting ripped off for hundreds of years and didn't care. We don't like being told what to do. That's the main thing. All of a sudden, we're being told what we can or can't do by England, and we get super grumpy over that. So England starts putting these taxes, these extra taxes on the stuff that we do. Now, keep in mind, if you lived in England, you didn't have to pay these taxes. All right, because England thinks the colonists should have to foot the bill for that war that we didn't even care about altogether, even though it was to benefit them so that they wouldn't lose their income. So every time they put a new tax on it, America gets super mad about the fact it's not about the money, but it's about the fact that they think we should have to pay for it, and they're trying to make us do something that we don't want to do. America's pretty stubborn. So the colonists are really mad about the fact that we have no say-so. All right, because there's a parliament now over in England who makes these taxes, but there's not a single person in that parliament that represents the colonists. They all represent just the people in England. So we start getting squirrely over here saying we refuse to pay these taxes unless we're represented in their Congress, in their parliament. So our rallying cry here is no taxation without representation. Basically you ain't making us pay all these dumb taxes unless we are represented over there and somebody's arguing on our behalf in England, which they're not. All right. So there's a lot of hostility in the 1760s between the colonists and England, which is like the mother country that owns the colonist. All right. This is a picture of King George. So King George, and we're going to reference him here quite a bit. I mean, he just looks, times like this. He just looks unlikable, doesn't he? So this is the king of England at the time. So this is the guy we're referencing, and he is not a big fan of America in any way, shape, or form. All right. So number 17, why were the American colonists upset over the British taxes? We were really upset because, first off, we didn't think we should have to pay them because we didn't care about the war. And secondly, we didn't like being told what to do. We just didn't. That's a big part of America is we don't like being told what to do. It's really not about the money because the taxes weren't that big. Like, if we're being honest, they weren't huge crushing taxes, but it was the fact that they were forcing us to pay them and we had no say-so in it really got us squirrely. All right. So here's how it escalates. As I'm trying to find a way to get out of here. All right. So England knows that we start getting mad. All right. So we start doing weird stuff like trying to boycott and refuse to pay the taxes. So England, King George, sends over a bunch of troops. Now, most of our hostilities come in our big cities, and our big city at the time was Boston. So he sent over a whole bunch of troops over in Boston basically to keep anything weird from happening. Well, all of a sudden, all these troops show up to basically like micromanage us. And so we start getting grumpy about that. What's interesting is the fact that when these, and they're called redcoats because the army at the time wore these bright red coats. the weapons weren't super accurate. They're very powerful, but not super accurate. So nobody worried about camouflage and trying to hide, because if you're going to fight somebody, you just go out in the middle of the field and stand 10 feet from them and shoot at each other. It's as dumb as it sounds. So all these redcoats show up, and the colonists view this as like a hostile invasion almost. Like, now keep in mind, the redcoats technically are the colonist army. Like, they should be protecting the colonists, but the colonists view it as like an aggressive invading force. So much so that when the redcoats started showing up, the colonists started making our own little militia, our own little army to fight against them. Now, keep in mind, the English had the most dominant military on the face of the earth at the time, and they're sending them over here into Boston. All right, we're pretty squirrely about it. There's a situation that happens in March of 1770. A group of so there were some drunk guys, and the amount of American stories that start out with, "Hey, look what this group of drunk guys did," is sadly staggering. They go out and they start harassing a group of redcoats. They're throwing snowballs and stuff at the redcoats. I mean, they're not throwing hand grenades at them. They are throwing snowballs. But the redcoats, these soldiers, all right, and they're about 17, 18, 19 years old. They're not much older than you are, stationed in another country. They get pretty upset about this, and a lot of tensions rise, and people start yelling and cussing at each other. And the redcoats, it is a pure on miscommunication. We'll talk a lot about it when we get to American One. There's a miscommunication that happens here, and the redcoats open fire into a crowd of unarmed citizens, all right, and they kill 5 of them. All right, so the redcoats kill 5 colonists. All right, they're not Americans yet because the revolution hadn't happened. They kill 5 colonists. All right, and it's an awful, and it was a mistake. Everybody admits that it was a mistake and shouldn't have happened. However, the next day, there's this guy named Paul Revere. Paul Revere runs a newspaper. Paul Revere calls this the Boston Massacre. Now, it's only 5 people that died, but he calls it the Boston Massacre. And he draws a picture that makes it look like that the redcoats did it on purpose. All right. By doing that, putting that in the paper the next day after this situation happened, it becomes known as the Boston Massacre. And now the colonists that are here basically fundamentally dislike the redcoats and view them as the enemy. If that wasn't already the mentality, that's how it is after 1770, the Boston Massacre. Then a couple years later, in Boston again, England jacks up the price of tea, which again, the fact that they're taxing us just really irks us. Not about the money, but about the fact they're forcing us to pay for something that we don't want. Everybody drank tea at the time because we were English citizens, and that's the culture of England is you drink tea. So they brought this big old boat over into Boston Harbor filled with tea. But we knew that they were going to jack up the prices of that tea when they brought it off the boat to sell it. So the people in Boston refused to let the boat get unloaded until England promised they weren't going to jack up the price of it. England won't promise this. And then a group of drunk guys, yes, again, in American history, it's staggering how many big situations happened with a group of drunk guys did something. A group of drunk guys decide to storm the ship in the middle of the night and throw millions of dollars of tea leaves into the harbor. The moment the tea leaves touch salt water, they're ruined. So because they're drunk, they didn't want to get caught. They're like, oh my gosh, they're all going to recognize us. So what all the drunk guys do, they all dress up like Indians. And it's really bad dress up as Indians. They look nothing like Indians. But a bunch of drunk guys dressed up like they're going to think the Indians did it. Nobody falls for that. But, and here's what's interesting. It's kind of a cool story. So the whole crowd shows up and watches them do it. Throw millions of dollars into the harbor. The next day, England is furious. They have all these redcoats out there like, who did it? Who did it? Everybody in Boston know exactly the group of men who did it. It was Sam Adams was the guy who organized it. Everybody knows it. Nobody in Boston snitches. Nobody. Everybody knows who it is. Like, I don't know. I think it was some Indians. Nobody in Boston snitches on these guys, and it ticks off King George. When King George finds out in England that not only did this happen, but nobody in Boston will tell him who did it, he punishes Boston by basically shutting down the harbor and says, until y'all pay back all that money that you just threw into the harbor, can't be friends. And he puts all these, what they're called the intolerable acts, all these laws on citizens in America that really tick off the colonists. Things like the colonists now have to house these redcoats. The redcoats are viewed as the enemy. Now every single house has to have a redcoat in their house and take care of them. That you can't do anything. The port gets closed. You can't make any money. You can barely survive. You can't do anything until you pay back all this money, or you turn in who it is. So instead of snitching, the colonists just get really, really angry. Keep in mind, the colonists don't even have an army. Like we're starting to get like a little militia together. England's the most advancedly trained military on earth. It would be like Moxville would be like the colonists, and England would be like the United States of America military. Like Moxville militia should not attack the United States military, but that's the like equivalent of what's going on here. So people will gather in Philadelphia, and they're going to discuss how to move forward with this. All right. So number 18, what was particularly upsetting to the Americans about the tax on tea? It's one part of that, it's like all the taxes. We're basically being forced to do something that we don't want to with no say-so. The second part is like you're hitting us right in our culture, man. Like tea is just a part of English culture, and we were at the time part of English culture. Like it just seems like a jerk move. It's something that everybody uses, and to tax that just really seemed to kind of to be a low blow. It seems to be an unnecessary thing to tax because you're like going right after the culture here in the colonies. Because of the tax on tea, people stopped drinking tea. And this is really the beginnings in America of people starting to drink coffee instead of tea. And when I keep saying tea, let me clarify. I'm not talking about sweet tea. I'm talking about hot tea, which is kind of, in your mind, it's like coffee. It's not sweet, or it's not like Bojangles sweet tea. This is like hot tea. All right. And this is a drawing of what happened. Notice they're all throwing the boxes of these tea leaves in the ocean and destroying them. Everybody's here watching it. They're all dressed up like Indians because, again, they were drunk and they thought people wouldn't notice who they were if they all dressed up like Indians. All right. So here's what ends up happening. America, we try to talk to King George. King George, when we send him a letter to try to like tone down because the tensions are rising, King George rips up our letter because he doesn't think that the colonists have a right to talk to him because he is so much above them. So America, we're going to get squirrely about that. We adamantly believe that like one human isn't above the other. Now, the fact that we have slavery in the United States is one of the biggest hypocrisies ever, because we're going to write all this stuff in the Declaration of Independence about all men are created equal. One man can't hold down another, while people in America literally have slaves. But we're talking about how America is fed up with King George and the English thinking they are superior to America. And it leads to the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is written by a guy named Thomas Jefferson, among others. And it's a breakup letter to England. It's like, hey, England, just want to let you know that we're not a thing anymore. We're our own country. It's not you, it's me. I deserve better. And we break up with England in the Declaration of Independence. We know England is not going to take this well at all. But Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, took a lot from John Locke's idea of life, liberty, and property. And this is where he puts in that all humans have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because that makes more sense. The pursuit of happiness means more sense than what property does when John Locke wrote that. They also believe in this concept of popular sovereignty, that governments only gain their power by the people. So the people have to support the government. If the people don't support the government can't exist. The people don't support King George is what he's saying. So therefore your government can't be in charge of us. Clearly England is furious, absolutely ballistic on this. And they're like, rah! All right. So England should come over here and beat the living bejesus out of us. Like it should last about 3 days. However, very lucky on our part. At the exact same time, France, the second most powerful country on earth, declares war on England. So England has to keep like 98% of their military home to go fight France and only sends like 2% of their military over to America. They come over here. A bunch of Americans in the colonies, you have to basically choose a side once you get over here, and most people chose the side of the Americans, and they're called the Patriots, are going to fight against the 2% of the British army that showed up. It's still going to take years. The Battle of Saratoga was the turning point. It was the first time we actually won a battle against them. And then by the time we get to Yorktown, and it's a really interesting way this all worked out. But eventually we're just going to wear them down because we won't stop fighting. And the British end up surrendering to the Americans. All right, because again, they only sent like 2% of their military. They surrendered to us, and we signed the Treaty of Paris, which allows America to become our own country. And England goes back and they're like, fine, whatever. And England's kind of squirrely about it, but the Treaty of Paris now allows America to be our own country. Now, this is a picture of old TJ, Thomas Jefferson. It's a very good picture of him. It's clearly a new one. This was not painted back then. All right. So the question here is, why is it so important to get France involved in the American Revolutionary War? So this is something I didn't mention. So France, yes, they're fighting England. They keep them occupied. That is a big part of it. We had to have France on our side. Now, France, they are more than happy to join us. And the reason they want to join us is they know if America is not giving England money, this makes England weaker and therefore helps out France, and France might be the most powerful country in Europe then. So France desperately wants us to win because it will hurt England. One of the things that France has that we desperately need, and without this we would not have won, is a navy. We don't have any naval ships, all right? England has the most powerful navy on earth. We need some type of navy. So what ends up happening is France joins and they bring over their navy, and it's very helpful. And without their navy, and without our ability to move around with the protection of the French navy, there's like no way we would have been able to win. So it's very important that France got involved with the American Revolutionary War because we needed their navy, and we also needed them over in Europe to keep England occupied till we can beat them, because we had no business beating them in combat at all. Random tidbit. So the Statue of Liberty, all right, that is a trophy that France gives us 100 years after this. So 100 years of America existing is, so this is 1776. 100 years later in 1876, France gives us a trophy like, hey, y'all actually did it. Good job. We didn't want to give it to you right away because we thought y'all might collapse, but you've made it 100 years. Congratulations. So the Statue of Liberty is France's big trophy that they gave us for winning the Revolutionary War. So the head general in the American Revolutionary War for America is this dude right here, George Washington. Very good general. And he's going to end up becoming the first president in the United States. But that ends up being the question here. What type of government are we going to create? So we had a little hiccup with our first government, lasted about 10 years, and we're going to scratch that one and start over. We are going to create a democratic republic. This has never been done before. All right. So in this class, we had talked about how Rome was a republic and Greece was a democracy, but both of them had their issues with it. We're going to create a whole new type of government called a democratic republic. And here it's called a federal republic. What this means. So like in a democracy, everybody votes on every laws. Democracy means you vote all the time. Republic means you have people that represent you, but they're usually appointed. What America does, and a lot of countries have copied us since then, is we look at what Montesquieu, John Locke, Rousseau, these enlightened thinkers have done, and we say, hey, how about we create a democratic republic? Meaning, the people in America don't vote for laws. Sorry, the people in America don't vote for laws. What they vote for is the representatives to go represent them, and the representatives vote for laws. If you don't like what your representatives are doing, then you just vote in somebody else that you do. So this is how we are a democracy, but we also have representatives at the same time. We don't individually vote on laws at the federal level. So this is a brand new type of government that comes out. It's a lot of smart people look at a lot of other smart people, and we kind of made this thing from scratch. It has worked so well that present day, when a country becomes a democracy, they typically look at what got done here, what we still use today, and see what works and what doesn't work. So it's pretty impressive these guys came up with a brand new government, unlike England, who they're like, let's go back to a king and queen. America just creates an entire one from scratch, and it ends up being pretty effective. So number 20, what did the founding fathers intentionally leave the federal government weak at first? So the federal government now in America is much stronger than it was originally. At first, the federal government in America was very weak. And the big reason for that is the last thing people in America wanted was to have a king. They didn't want a monarch. They didn't want somebody to tell them what they could or couldn't do. So at first, the federal government was extremely weak and couldn't do a whole lot because people in America don't like being told what to do. Over time, it becomes obvious that they need to have a little bit more power to be able to do their job. But generally speaking, Americans don't like being told what to do. And that is why the federal government in the United States originally was left very weak, so they wouldn't even have the authority to tell people what they can or can't do. I will see you guys.